welcome to List Lab, a Viking warlord thrown into a snake pit, dying in Northumbria, while his sons swear revenge, is one of the most famous stories of the early medieval world. But when we move closest to the Viking Age itself, the trail becomes strangely uncertain. Because the records that should show Ragnar Lodbrok most clearly struggle to show him at all. So was Ragnar a real leader, later wrapped in legend, a memory made from several different men, or a powerful story invented to explain events that were already slipping into myth? In this investigation, we will follow the evidence from England and Francia to the later writers of Iceland and Denmark, separating what can be supported from what was shaped later into dramatic narrative. If you enjoy calm, evidence-based mysteries like this, subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment genuinely helps List Lab grow and tells YouTube there is an audience for careful history. And as we go, tell us which source you trust most, because Ragnar is not just a story about one man. He is also a story about how the Viking Age itself was remembered, reshaped, and made unforgettable. Ragnar Lodbrok enters history in one of the strangest ways possible, because he feels famous before he feels secure. In Saga tradition, he arrives fully formed, a sea king, raider, ruler, monster slayer, husband, father, and doomed hero, as if the audience is already expected to know his name. He wins a bride by killing a serpent, and he earns the name Lodbrok through the shaggy protective trousers he wears in the fight. From there, the story expands outward into dynasty, vengeance, and fate, until Ragnar becomes the center of a family whose names echo across the Viking world. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Halfdan, and Uber are all drawn into the same orbit, as if one father could explain an entire generation of conquest. By the time most people encounter Ragnar today, he does not feel like one disputed figure among many. He feels like the Viking Age given a face. That is exactly what makes him so difficult, because the closer we get to the 9th century, the less solid that picture becomes. English chronicles record the arrival of the Viking Great Army in the autumn of 865 AD, and they describe a real and devastating military force wintering in England and tearing through fractured kingdoms. In the later Saga version, these men are Ragnar's sons, invading to avenge their father after King Alla has him cast into a snake pit in Northumbria. Yet the near-contemporary English sources do not stop to tell that story. Not even briefly. They do not explain a father, a snake pit, or a revenge oath. Instead, they show political collapse, contested kingship, the struggle for York, and ruthless campaigning, while Ragnar himself stays just beyond the edge of the frame. Even Aella, so central to the later legend, appears in the English record less like a theatrical tyrant and more like a ruler trapped in civil conflict. So the mystery deepens, because we are not only asking whether Ragnar existed, we are asking why such a vivid and specific story became dominant when the earliest witnesses are so restrained. To understand that gap, we have to ask when Ragnar truly enters the written record and what kind of record it actually is. Saxo Grammaticus wrote his Latin history of the Danes in the late 12th century, centuries after the raids Ragnar is supposed to have led, and in Saxo's hands Ragnar is supposed to have led, and in Saxo's hands Ragnar becomes a heroic ancestor in a grand national past. In Iceland, works like the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons were written down later still. In the 13th or early 14th century, inside a Christian, literate culture, deeply interested in genealogy, memory, and heroic storytelling, these texts may preserve older oral material, but they also shape that material into satisfying plots, complete with motives, symbolism, and neatly arranged family lines. A poem often called Crackemore puts dramatic final words in Ragnar's mouth as he faces death. But it too belongs to a much later world than the one Ragnar is supposed to have inhabited. Earlier medieval writers outside Scandinavia sometimes attach names resembling Lodbrok to important Viking leaders, yet still stop short of giving us a securely documented Ragnar. The contrast is striking. The legend is rich, coherent, and unforgettable, while the earliest evidence is broken, partial, and frustratingly quiet. That silence has encouraged many alternative explanations, and one of the most common begins with loss and suppression. The argument is that Christian scribes controlled much of what survived in writing, and they had little reason to preserve a proud pagan founding figure in full detail unless he served their own purpose. In that view, Viking leaders usually appear in monastic and royal records when they threaten kingdoms, burn churches, or disturb Christian order, so the story we inherit is shaped by fear, politics, and moral judgment from the start. Supporters of this idea also point out that Scandinavian society relied heavily on oral tradition, meaning many stories may never have existed in stable written form or may have been lost before anyone committed them to parchment. They argue that even when Christian authors did record older traditions, they could strip away meanings that no longer fit, turning complex ancestral memory into moral drama or simplified warning. From that perspective, Ragnar's absence from the earliest record is not treated as decisive disproof. It is treated as the kind of silence history produces when one culture writes about another from the outside. That does not prove Ragnar existed, but it helps explain why the question refuses to disappear. A second alternative view argues that modern readers are sometimes too quick to dismiss the historical value of legend. Sagas may contain monsters, prophetic dreams, and impossible set pieces, but they also preserve real geography, social codes, feud structures, voyages, and remembered names that sometimes overlap with independent evidence. From this perspective, Ragnar is not a fictional invention in the modern sense, but something more difficult, a real memory blurred by repetition, performance, and time. Supporters of this position argue that the leaders of the Great Army were famous enough to attract origin stories almost immediately, and those stories may preserve the outline of a genuine founder figure even when the details expanded around him. They point to the repeated way. Later, tradition keeps connecting Ragnar to major Viking names, as though an older memory continued insisting on the relationship even after facts had begun to drift. They also note that Lodbrok sounds exactly like the kind of striking epithet that oral tradition could preserve long after dates and events had become unstable. The claim is not that every saga scene happened literally as told. It is that history often survives in distorted form, and that a real Ragnar may still stand somewhere behind the literary shadow. Mainstream historians begin from a stricter principle. A detailed biography needs support from sources close to the events, and Ragnar Lodbrok does not have that support. There is no 9th century Scandinavian life of Ragnar, no dated charter securely naming him as the saga hero, and no dated charter securely naming him as the saga hero, and no contemporary annal that presents the famous sequence of serpent slaying, snake pit death, and sons launching a revenge invasion. What survives instead are later narratives that combine heroic folklore with pieces of real history, written by medieval authors for medieval audiences who valued pattern, ancestry, and dramatic causation. The Ragnar of saga literature is built from exactly the kinds of elements that make stories endure: memorable motifs, proud speeches, violent reversals, symbolic deaths, and genealogical links that tie famous men together. Saxo's version is no neutral field report either, because he is writing a national history and shaping heroes who reflect ideals important in his own age. So the strongest official conclusion is careful rather than dismissive. The full life of Ragnar, as preserved in later tradition, is best treated first as literature and cultural memory, not as straightforward documentation from the Viking Age. That does not make it meaningless. It means the text tells us more securely about how later societies imagined the past than about what one 9th century man certainly did. Where the evidence becomes firmer is not with Ragnar himself, but with the war leaders later described as his sons. English and Irish annals record Viking figures with names matching Ivar and Halfdan during the campaigns of the Great Army, and archaeology supports the reality of large, organized Viking forces, wintering in England and operating across several kingdoms over multiple years. In that landscape, we can confirm disruption, mobility, military planning, and named commanders, even when the sources do not always agree on family ties. Excavated winter camps and burial contexts linked to Great Army activity support the scale and seriousness of the campaigns, but archaeology cannot simply point to a skeleton and announce Ragnar's bloodline with certainty. This creates a strong pressure in later storytelling, because famous leaders invite famous ancestry, and one commanding father is a powerful way to bind separate careers into one memorable narrative. Some medieval writers start supplying that missing link long before the famous sagas fully bloom. An 11th century writer like Adam of Bremen refers to a Viking called Ingvar as the son of Lodbrok, and later traditions go further, connecting Lodbrok to leaders and even symbols like the Raven banner. In Iceland, Ari the Wise, writing in the early 12th century, used the killing of Saint Edmund as a dating point and named Ivar as the son of Ragnar Lodbrok. None of this is contemporary proof that Ragnar lived exactly as described, but it does show that the Ragnar connection was circulating in medieval memory well before later writers turned it into a complete and gripping life story. Then there is Paris, the most tempting moment of all, because here a name resembling Ragnar appears close to a securely dated event. On the 29th of March 845 AD, Vikings attacked Paris, and Frankish sources describe the assault, the defeat of Frankish resistance, and the tribute paid to persuade the raiders to leave. Some versions of the tradition name the Viking leader as Reginherus, a Latin form that may connect in some way to Ragnar, and historians have long wondered whether this raider could be one of the historical seeds later absorbed into the Lodbrok legend. But this is where the argument has to stay disciplined. The raid itself is well attested. The exact identity of the leader is less certain. The leap from Reginherus to the full saga Ragnar is possible, but still speculative. If the Paris raider really contributed to the Ragnar tradition, then another problem appears immediately, because a leader active around 845 AD cannot easily be the same man who dies decades later in the fully developed Northumbrian revenge story, at least not without stretching chronology beyond comfort. That is why many mainstream historians see Ragnar as a composite figure, created when different leaders, raids, memories, and regional traditions gradually fused into one heroic biography. Another possibility is that several men named Ragnar existed, and later storytellers merged them, attaching Lodbrok to the version that best served the legend. In either case, Paris shows how a real and dramatic event could be drawn into the making of myth, but it still stops short of giving us one fully documented Ragnar Lodbrok. After following the sources, Ragnar Lodbrok does not disappear, but he refuses to stand still. The texts that give him a complete life are late, literary, and shaped by authors who wanted the past to feel coherent, meaningful, and dramatically satisfying. Yet the legend did not emerge from nowhere, because the Viking Great Army and the leaders associated with it are historically visible, and their campaigns transformed England and echoed across Europe. Ragnar offers something history often does not, a clean line of cause and effect, one father, one death, one vengeance, one reason the storm broke. Real history is rarely that tidy, which is exactly why the story endured. It gave later generations a way to remember violence, leadership, dynasty, and identity in a form they could pass on. Even if Ragnar is composite, the legend still contains truth of a different kind. The mystery is not only who Ragnar was, but why medieval Europe needed him to be there. So was Ragnar real, or was he Viking legend? The most careful answer is that we cannot confirm a 9th century Ragnar Lodbrok in the full saga sense. And the safest conclusion is that the figure was shaped from several strands of memory rather than preserved intact from one life. Yet the persistence of the connection, appearing across different regions and kinds of medieval writing before the great saga texts were written down, suggests that the tradition itself was already old by the 11th and 12th centuries. Perhaps there was a feared raider whose name resembled Ragnar. Perhaps there were several. Perhaps Lodbrok began as a separate label that later fused with a remembered dynasty of war leaders. What remains unresolved is whether one man truly stands behind the legend, or whether the legend is what happens when many real lives are folded into one unforgettable ancestor. And that uncertainty may be the most revealing part of all, because it shows how oral memory, political storytelling, and written history can weave together until the join disappears. Ragnar may fade when we try to pin him down as a single man, but his survival tells us something larger: how the Viking Age became a story the medieval world could not stop retelling. Ragnar Lodbrok may be less a man we can prove and more a mirror reflecting what later generations wanted the Viking Age to mean. So, what do you think is more likely? A real Ragnar remembered imperfectly, or a legend built from many lives and shaped into one heroic past? If you enjoyed this investigation, please like the video, subscribe to ListLab, and leave your view in the comments, because those simple actions really do help the channel grow and help more people find careful history without the noise.